Someone in your group just died. It's 100,000 years ago. You're in a cave somewhere in what will eventually become Morocco. There are maybe 25 of you. You've known this person your entire life. They hunted with you. They knew where the water was in summer. They remembered which plants made you sick. And now they're on the ground, still, eyes open. The smell will start in hours. Hyenas will pick up the scent by nightfall. The group is watching you. The elders, the children, waiting to see what happens next, because something has to happen next. You can't just leave them. But you're not entirely sure why you can't. You just know that you can't. Hold on to that feeling, because here's what should be impossible. A species with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's was doing exactly this, deliberately placing their dead 300,000 years ago, before modern humans existed. And for a long time, we had no idea, and scientists still aren't entirely sure why. So where did this start, and what does it mean that every culture in human history, every single one ever discovered, developed a way to deal with their dead? For most of the 20th century, the standard story was that intentional burial was invented by modern Homo sapiens around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Before that, animals died, bodies got left, scavengers came, bones scattered. Nothing deliberate. That story collapsed. In 2013, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger led a team into a narrow cave system in South Africa called Rising Star. They had to send researchers small enough to crawl through a passage 18 centimeters wide, about the width of your shoulder, to reach a deep chamber 100 meters underground. What they found there was 1,550 bone fragments belonging to at least 15 individuals. The species was Homo naledi, a hominin with a brain roughly a third the size of yours, comparable in volume to a chimpanzee's. Nobody else was down there. No predators, no signs of flooding that could have washed them in. Homo naledi had been deliberately placing their dead in this chamber. The dating came back between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. That predates modern Homo sapiens. A species we'd never even heard of before 2015 was burying its dead before we existed. So the question stopped being, when did humans start burying their dead? It became something harder. If a species with a brain that small was doing this, what were they actually capable of understanding? And why were they doing it at all? The first answer was practical, and it had teeth. When someone in your group died in the open, you had maybe 2 hours before the smell carried. Spotted hyenas can detect a carcass from 4 kilometers away with a bite force of over 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone to powder. Vultures circling overhead were a signal to every predator in the area. A grieving group of 20 people, distracted, emotionally disrupted, gathered in one spot, was an opportunity for something larger and hungrier. So the earliest forms of body disposal weren't rituals in any spiritual sense, they were defense. Bodies were placed in natural crevices, caves, or densely packed shells of rock, not to honor the dead, but to contain the smell and block scavenger access. Fire was used around the body, not as a funeral pyre, not yet, but as a perimeter. The same fire that protected living camps, protected the newly dead because the smell of smoke disrupts scent tracking. And someone had to stay. Someone had to guard. In Kebara Cave in Israel, a Neanderthal burial was found dating to 60,000 years ago. The grave was deliberately dug. You can tell because the soil composition inside the pit is different from the surrounding sediment. The Neanderthal was placed on his back, left arm across his torso. His hyoid bone, the small bone in the throat involved in the mechanics of speech, was intact. Hyoid bones are almost never preserved because they're so small and fragile. This one survived 60,000 years because the body was buried quickly, carefully, and protected. Someone stood watch long enough to do it right. The Neanderthals were doing this 20,000 years before any so-called human revolution. They were digging graves. They were staying through the night. The practical and the deliberate were already inseparable. But once the body was protected, something else started happening. Something harder to explain. At Kebara Cave in Israel dating to around 92,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of at least 27 individuals. Red ochre pigment scattered on the bones, a deer antler placed across the arms of a child. Someone moved that antler there. Someone made a choice about where it should go. Then there is Shanidar Cave in Iraq, and this is where it gets genuinely contested. Pollen samples from one burial suggested flowers had been placed on the body, hyacinths, bachelor's buttons, groundsel. Some researchers believe this was an intentional act of mourning. Others argue the pollen was carried in by a burrowing rodent. After the fact, the question has never been definitively settled. Did a Neanderthal grieve with flowers? We don't know. And that open question is part of what makes this record so fascinating. We are reading intention from bone and dust, and the margin for debate is real. What isn't disputed at Archaeology Cave in Italy? A young man buried 23,000 years ago had been covered in red ochre and wore a headdress of perforated shells and deer teeth. Someone dressed him for wherever they thought he was going. And then there is Sungir, Russia, 34,000 years ago. Archaeologists found a man and two children. The man was covered in thousands of ivory beads. Researchers estimate it would have taken 10,000 hours of labor to produce them. The children were buried head-to-head, surrounded by carved mammoth ivory, fox teeth, and two straightened mammoth tusks over 2 meters long. Straightening a frozen mammoth tusk requires sustained heat and precise pressure. Someone planned this. Someone spent weeks preparing for the burial of two children. This isn't defense. This isn't predator management. This is grief taking a form. Not every ancient culture buried their dead, and what they did instead tells you just as much. Take Mungo Lady, found in Lake Mungo, Australia, dating to around 20,000 years ago. She was cremated. Her bones were crushed, then cremated, again. The deliberateness of doing it twice is hard to overstate. This isn't disposal. This is ritual so committed, it performs itself more than once. Then there is Tatalhuyuk in Turkey, dating to 9,000 years ago, where people were buried under the floors of their own homes. Evidence suggests the living slept and worked directly above the bones of their ancestors, not out of morbidity, but proximity, to stay close, to keep them inside the boundary of the living. Sky burial, practiced across multiple independent ancient cultures and still observed in Tibetan Buddhism today, operates on the opposite logic: return the body upward, to the birds, to the sky. The oldest mortuary platforms in the record date to over 10,000 years ago. Secondary burial. Enter the body, let it decompose, then retrieve the bones and rebury them in a communal space, appears across multiple continents. Every method is different, but every method shares one thing: the body is not abandoned. A line is drawn between dying and just ceasing to be. Whatever form it takes, something is done. Here's what all of that points to, and this is the part that should make you stop. Researchers analyzing the cognitive prerequisites for intentional burial have argued that deliberate burial requires a theory of mind. The ability to understand that others have interior experiences different from your own. To grieve is to understand that something is gone that was real to someone else, not just to you. To bury is to act on that understanding. Every species on Earth loses members. Elephants have been observed returning to the bones of their dead, touching them with their trunks, standing quietly. Chimpanzees have been documented carrying dead infants for weeks, grooming them, sitting with them. Crows hold what researchers describe as funerals, gatherings around dead members of their group. These behaviors are real, and they are remarkable. But only one species digs a hole first. The moment a Homo Naledi placed a body in a chamber 100 meters underground 300,000 years ago with a brain we would not have predicted capable of it, something was already present. Not theology, not tradition. A recognition that the person who died had been a person, that their death required a response. Beyond moving on, we still don't fully understand how a brain that size got there. That question is still open. We built cities, we built religions, we built entire philosophical systems to answer the questions those early graves were already asking. Where did they go? What do we owe them? What does it mean that we remember them when they can no longer remember anything? The first person who carried a body into that chamber in South Africa, who stayed through the dark to make sure nothing got to them, didn't have language for what they were doing. They didn't have theology or tradition. They just knew that abandoning that person was something they couldn't do. Every grave ever dug since then has been the same answer to the same question. We don't leave each other behind.